Let me begin by saying I agree completely with what Dr. Grace has said. So I was having a hard time thinking about what to say about this because around about $1 billion has been spent on aflatoxin since it was discovered in 1962, and you could fill the room with information. In the church that I go to this summer, we've heard this lesson a few times, and I thought about this in relation to the 5 loaves of bread. At least the Christians in the room will know what I mean. Jesus was able to find 5 loaves of barley bread, and in my heart and in my head, I know that was safe. And I know that because it was barley, which comes from Ethiopia, and it's dry land grain production, so there was no toxin in that grain. In North America, in the United States and Canada, we spend between $250 million and $2.5 billion a year keeping the 3 most important mycotoxins out of our food supply. So for those 5 loaves of bread in Canada or in the United States, we pay a lot. For perspective, in 2012, the United States had a very large aflatoxin problem in its corn crop. That raised the price of sugar and grain corn 10% all over the world. We just bought our way out of it, and I could give many more examples of that. So I want to think about that, what we're willing to pay for that 5 loaves of bread. The populations that I've been interested in as an avocation, and I am not looking for money, I am looking for church support in a particular thing though, are the countries that are food insecure, and mostly they're in Africa. But when I started to work, they were also in China, in parts of Asia, all of which had substantial problems with mycotoxin problems, not always aflatoxin. And in my career, I've seen investments and change made. Once you got food sufficiency, you can do a lot with what I would call common sense. So in those food insecure areas, as Amari brought this up, a study that will be released in a month or so that PACA did, that's very well done in my opinion. The prevalence of aflatoxin, which is only one of the toxins, is extremely high. And the more disturbing part of it, which isn't captured in prevalence data, is that a lot of the values are actually very high indeed, and I'll comment more on that. There's 2 important things that I think about this. This is a slide that came from a British Medical Research Council scientist who'd spent his whole life working on stunting in the Gambia. And so at the end of his career, he wrote this paper, and he talked about all the things that he'd learned about stunting. So that's a child, as you can see, normalized in the Gambia in the years that he studied. When the child is nursing, you can see it gains weight. And when it's weaned, often quite early, it starts to lose weight. And there are lots of things that we know about that. Poor nutrition, repeated diarrheal infections. But what was frustrating to Dr. Lund was that he said, I've studied this whole my life, and we thought about everything that we could do to fix this, and we can only fix about half of it at best. So there's something we're missing that's important. And around that time, the current director of the IARC, Chris Wild, was working in the Gambia and started to measure aflatoxin in blood. So I'm going to return to that, in blood. And so Dr. Lund said maybe it's because of these extremely poisonous compounds that are present in the diet of the folks there. Amari already mentioned this, so this is Felicia Wu's estimate, but in the fully developed market economies, we keep aflatoxin out of our food at great expense. It's just invisible to consumers because of liver cancer, which is basically an end-of-life disease. So a big proportion of the liver cancer that's attributed, at least by Felicia, to aflatoxin occurs in Africa, which isn't a big surprise. But the comment I wanted to make is that you actually have to live a fairly long time for that cancer to be expressed. And it doesn't mean that there aren't really quite unpleasant changes going on in the liver of the people that are exposed. The liver is being damaged. It's not a theoretical thing at all. It's just invisible. You're not throwing up. You're not got a fever and so on. So I want to return to a picture that there's a few of you in the audience who's heard me speak about this. So this is a picture of two little boys I took in Benin in 1995, which has been very much a motivator for me in thinking about that 5 loaves of bread. They were very happy little boys in this village. The corn that the porridge was made out of, you can see a bowl in the hands of one, was at least 25% insect parts because the storage was with all respect, it was totally crap storage. And I wish I could say in the worst areas it's much better now, but I can't. So you can imagine what that was like, but it was full of aflatoxin, and it was full of another toxin called fumonisn, which only comes from corn. And so I know that, measured it. And so what is going on in those two little boys? Well, the aflatoxin, the cancer part is they're initiated because males are more susceptible, and little males are hypersusceptible to the cancer initiation process of aflatoxin. But their livers are being damaged. So your liver is a pretty important organ. In ecological, epidemiological studies, the toxin's also affecting immune systems. It absolutely does in relevant animal models. As I said, you could fill this room with papers about aflatoxin. We know a lot about it because we don't want it in our food system, so we studied it carefully. The fumonisn is interesting. It was only discovered in 1988 as opposed to 1962. And it's the most powerful cancer promoter we've ever discovered. So aflatoxin, the most powerful genotoxic carcinogen that humans are exposed to on a regular basis, and fumonisn, the most potent cancer promoter, that's a pretty exciting combination from a public health perspective. It's also somewhat probably associated with stunting, but we don't really know that very much. So I want to talk about, not talking about 34,000 feet and measurements and crops which don't work in any country. If you measure toxins in the crops in Italy and then say how much the Italians here are exposed to, it does not connect to what's in their blood. So one of the big innovations in the past decade has been to really, let's measure what you're actually exposed to in the blood. So this would be like if you have 1 glass of wine and you measure your blood alcohol, everybody knows that you can do that, you would probably still be okay to drive. If you had 5, you would not be okay to drive, and you'd be able to measure the blood alcohol. So I just want to look at those, the chart that's there, just so you can get it in your mind. So this is measuring, if you like, the active ingredient of aflatoxin, the epoxide, coupled weakly to a protein in the blood. And so the first really serious measurements were made in China, where there was extraordinary rates of liver cancer because the whole population essentially was dependent on food that was highly contaminated with aflatoxin, and that didn't change until the political decisions have been made. And as they'd lowered that level over the past decades, the cancer rate has gone down accordingly, regardless of the carcinogenic virus hepatitis B. So the red data talk about Bangladesh. So these are pregnant women in Bangladesh. And the level at which a liver would be fried is around 100 fried, I mean really damaged, around 100 on that scale, which is a log scale. But still there's damage at much above 10. Population of children in Nigeria, which had severe doctor-diagnosed, the two forms of doctor-diagnosed stunting in a hospital. All the treatments made, but still there was an appreciable amount of aflatoxin in the blood. The 2-year-old refers to a population which was stunted in Africa. And recently I have working on data from 175 pregnant women in Rwanda. So we can talk about how well we're doing, but this is what's in their blood. 100% of them were 10 times over the cancer level. 35% were 100 times over, meaning in the liver frying category. 35% of them are also exposed to fumonisin at the same time, and 5% at the level that we know affects humans from studies done in South America. So we're sure about that. And I just captured some data from Wally, which is not published yet, and you can see it's actually higher than the two sets of data that I've shown you. So one of the reasons I've felt that we've been able to avoid discussing this seriously is that unlike many other things that we could measure, malaria and so on, we can't easily know, okay, how much is in your blood? Now, in the very far right, there's a 2012, and that's the aflatoxin in the blood of Americans in the NHANES, which is around 4,000 systematic data. And you can quite plainly see that Americans, given that it's a log scale, are really in a different position altogether because we spend $2 million. The last thing that I want to say, which returns to my ask of the churches particularly, is that in this city in 1966, because of the World Food Protein Supplementation Program, which was peanuts, so that started in 1948, and the vision was there were all these starving kids in India and Africa, and they were protein energy malnourished, so that we should feed them peanut butter. And that made good sense. But they quickly realized in India and in the peanut areas of Africa, a lot of this literature is in French, but it's all published, that they were dying, that their livers were being severely damaged. All of this is published. And so they came in, this is the headline in Nature, to this city, and I know one of the people, he's still alive, who was there, and another person I met who was president, who died some years ago. And they decided that this was a crisis and that they should set a limit of 30 ppb for the food, the protein supplementation, which is actually a pretty good number that we know today. And that was set 60 some years ago, and we still know. But in Mary's study, I think it's right that about half of the people over that. So when the question was asked, where does this fungus come from? It comes from God. Why is it a big problem? Well, it's a big problem because we grow particular crops in unfavorable areas and store them badly. That's been known since the 60s. And how can we mobilize information that we know about to help especially the poorest of the poor, and work through the street food people, which has worked in Asia. I've seen it work there. And maybe just the last thing I'll say to return to the church again. In the 16th century, ergotism in Europe was causing what some believe to be divine punishment, St. Anthony's fire, and it also would cause limbs to fall off. There's a famous Peter Bruegel painting of that. So the government of France, the prime minister was a duke, his peasants were suffering, so he said, go figure it out, to the scientists that he had. And they said, you know, if you sieve out those dark things in the grain, then animals don't get sick, so probably we should do that. And so the church and the state marketed that information to peasants in 1600, and that reduced the rate of ergotism in French villages from pretty bad in some years. So the social marketing to the right community was arguably the first success in chemical food safety, at least that I know. So for me, it's kind of depressing that if a meeting we could go back to 1966 on this topic, people would be saying roughly the same thing after spending billions of dollars later. But I do emphasize that in Europe and in North America, we spend a mountain of money. All of the food companies, including those represented here, spend a mountain of money to keep it out of our food system. So that's what I'd like to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.